Hi everybody! My name is Michelle the Bookworm, and in this week's video I'm going to be talking about a book that I read recently. A lot of you have probably heard about it. It has a really popular movie that's been out that every time I mention this book somebody told me that I should watch it. It is Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen. I've heard this book referenced a lot before, and I kind of saw it at an airport at Powell's, and I've always been really interested in mental illness and kind of like the stories that people have behind that, so this book really captivated me, and I'd like to talk about it. So this book, Girl Interrupted, is a memoir about Susanna Kaysen, and she was 18 years old. She was admitted into a psych ward where she spent the next 2 years of her life. So this book is real, and I'd like to approach this topic with some empathy, and as I'm criticizing this book, my goal is to discuss what I find interesting, not necessarily what I find wrong or right about this book, because this is her experience and I want to be aware of that. So first, what I would like to talk about what I liked about the book. What I liked about the book is the way that Susanna wrote her story. She gave the book a sense of mystery. We don't really know what diagnosis she necessarily has. She writes in first and third person all the time, and this is very insightful. It really helps to kind of give the reader an insight into what it's like to interact and just be aware of the difficulties that people with mental illness come across on a daily basis. And we believe that she's doing this just as a writer, and we find out later on that it's actually due to the type of disorder that she has. So first I'd like to discuss a lot of the important themes that I found in this book, and there's so many of them. I only picked the ones that I thought were that really stood out for me. The first one that I really appreciate is how Susanna humanizes mental illness in this text. There's a huge giant stigma against the term mental illness or in this society, and this is particularly true back in 1967 when Susanna was admitted into the psych ward. Susanna puts an actual face and a personality to these mental illnesses. When people think of schizophrenia, when people think of an eating disorder, they have this stereotypical image in their head, and what Susanna does is that she puts a person behind that disorder, because too frequently people will just judge based on that person just based on their disorder, and Susanna brings to light that that's just not true, that there's so many layers. For instance, there's this one girl that really stood out to me was Polly. In the very beginning of the novel, she was severely depressed. She had tried to burn herself alive, but while she had like so much hatred for herself, she was the first to comfort somebody who was feeling down, who was crying, who was having a mental breakdown, and it really shows just, you know, she's not just this person who lit herself on fire like everyone wants to see her to be. She is still, like, very much full of compassion. And this kind of leads into the other issue that I really like that Susanna does is that she uses these girls' stories to discuss the different issues surrounding mental illness. For instance, there's this one girl named Tori, and her family sends her to this psych ward, and this sparks the conversation within the novel that families send these parts of their families to a psych ward to either prove that either the family isn't crazy or that they're not the crazy one, she is. So she's either the scapegoat or she's proving that nobody's crazy. And I really feel that this is kind of pertains to today. A lot of people, it's just something that I have seen before in my life. Another issue that was brought up that really had an impact was just the stripping away of their identity in order to. They are told that they're not normal. They're told that the way that they think is not normal, that it's not correct. So they are basically being told that everything about them is not normal, not okay, and they're being reprogrammed, basically. One example of this was Lisa in the novel. She was coming out of isolation, and they had stripped her of her identity. They had cut her nails, which she was really proud of. They had cut her hair, and they took away an Indian belt that was given to her by her brother so that she couldn't hang herself. So this was really impactful because in order to protect her, they stripped away her identity, and she just became a vegetable sitting in front of the TV for the rest of the novel, unfortunately. Another way that they do this is that they have these rigorous rules throughout the novel. And this is because these patients are not considered or not treated as if they are normal, and they are treated as if they are dangerous. For instance, they're checked on every 15 minutes to make sure that they're not doing anything harmful. They're constantly searched for sharp objects, and they have this seclusion room where they are not allowed to be angry. They are not allowed to show their frustration and their anger. So if they want to vent, they have to be asked to be locked into a room where they can just let go of their feelings. So these girls weren't even allowed to express themselves like, people can today. And this stripping away of your identity and your role in society was discussed, and it kind of made me think a little bit that it was also liberating and isolating. Whereas you're completely cut off from the world, you can't really participate, you're also not forced to participate. You don't have to get a job, you don't have to talk with your family if you don't want to. You don't have to uphold those obligations. And there's no responsibilities, but there's no freedom, but there's also no responsibilities, which I found interesting. And so another important theme that I found in this novel that I thought was key was this idea of killing part of yourself. Within this novel, or memoir, I keep calling it a novel, but really it's important to remember that this is a memoir. Susanna had attempted to commit suicide, and she talks about how she only wanted to kill part of herself. She had wanted to kill the part of herself that wanted to die, and the part of herself that that was causing her problems. She was seeing shapes in the rugs, and oriental rugs gave her problems. She saw things in the patterns, and that she couldn't handle this anymore. She didn't know how to speak out about it. There probably wasn't really a lot of conversation about mental illness at this point in time to be able to talk about it, and she felt like there just wasn't really an escape. And I think that that's something that's still applicable today, is that it's definitely getting better, but this the stigma against mental illness is just so continuing today that it's hard to even talk about. It also, this idea of her seeing patterns reminded me of an essay called The Yellow Wallpaper, about this woman who had postpartum depression, and she also saw shapes in the wallpaper. And I think that that's kind of interesting that like this level of seeing patterns in finding meaning in patterns is transgressed from one medium to another. She also had a problem with faces, so whereas she was really like focused in on these patterns that may or may not have had meaning, she also didn't find meaning in people's faces. People's faces just seemed like blobs to her. And she was conscious of these misconceptions, which I found really interesting, that she was so aware of how she wasn't normal for society. And this also kind of made me think, this idea of wanting to kill that part of yourself, it kind of made me think about therapy as a whole, and how everyone's trying to better themselves, and this urge to want to destroy the part of yourself that you don't like, for instance, negative coping mechanisms, bad habits, that's something that I feel like everybody does. I don't feel like that's something that's completely abnormal. Maybe the way that she went about it was abnormal. Maybe the way that her brain interpreted that wasn't necessarily safe for her. But I think that the idea of that there is some part of you that you don't want, that you want to destroy, I feel like that's something that everybody can relate to. I mean, I know I can. And it's just something that was that I found kind of profound. The last thing that I found interesting in this book was this, and it kind of was hard for me to wrap my mind around. So in the book, she talks about mind versus brain, and it says, I'm looking down at my notes because I'm not gonna be able to remember everything, but she talks about how mind is the interpreter of the neurological activity in your brain, and how there's a second interpreter that checks the mind's work, and that the brain talks to itself and can change its perception, but mental illness is a miscommunication between the two interpreters. There's, you're doubting your perception is healthy, but if there's no doubt to your perception, then there's no way to take a step back and check what you're thinking is real. And I found that that was really interesting, that all mental illness is the inability for these two parts of your brain to communicate. It's just a signal loss. I am really hesitant to discuss what I didn't like about the book, because so I'm hesitant to critique this memoir because I don't want to discredit her experience. I absolutely love this book, and everything she wrote about is valid because it was her interpretation of her experience. So I would like to discuss the things that I thought were kind of abstract and still confusing. Particularly, I don't fully understand her parallel world that she created. She says that she knew what was going to happen when she, in the future. She also said that she would bounce in between one dimension and the other, and she was kind of like in this in-between space, and I didn't really fully understand that. Maybe I wasn't meant to, but it was a very interesting concept, and one that I kind of reviewed a bit, and I still would like to review more about it. And I think the worst part of this book that I really just didn't like was the scene where she's scratching at the back of her hand, and she starts getting really upset because she's scared that she doesn't have any bones because she's never seen any bones in her hand. That part really freaked me out. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one, but I have a really big issue with cutting into something that's alive. That's a phobia of mine. And so the description of her trying to peel back the skin of the back of her hand really freaked me out. I actually had to put the book down and stop and take a break for a little bit. So that was probably the worst part of the book for me that I was really squeamish about. Overall, again, it's really hard to rate and review a book like this, I feel like, because I don't want to discredit Susanna. So the review that I gave The Girl Interrupted is, I gave her a 4 out of 5. 4 out of 5. And I feel like this is a really interesting insight into the human psyche. And she gave some really, really, really good insight onto mental illness and the stigma behind mental illness. It definitely was a bit hard to follow. I feel sometimes it was very mundane. And it went from kind of like zero. Some of her stories went from like zero normalness to, oh, somebody died in 2.5 seconds, and that was extremely jarring. And it definitely added a layer of anxiety to the text, and excitement, but it still was very jarring. So the question that I have for you for this video is, have you read this book? What do you think of it? And just, I guess, like, I don't really have a question. I just want people to think about the different stigmas that they have heard and experienced about people with mental illness in their lives. And I don't actually have a question. I just want people to reflect and check yourself. Check your work. And check what prejudices you might have about mental illness. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!